Good morning. Let's spend some time together in God's Word. I'd like to share with you Daniel. So if you'll grab something to drink, we'll take a look at this book. And notice I'm sporting the stylish face coverings required by our governor. However, there is an exception. I don't have to wear it if I'm recording a lesson for you. So we're doing our best to comply with the laws that are put over us as believers. We look to a different kingdom that's coming with Christ. And Daniel is all about that. This book was written by Daniel. You can look at chapter 12, verse 4, where Daniel's told to seal the book, but there's really no debate among conservatives as to who wrote it. Those who are not conservative, who don't believe in prophecy, they try to come up with other people because the specificity with which Daniel is given, the outfolding of the world, is hard for those who don't have a God that reveals things to comprehend. Daniel was taken as a young man, probably 16, in 605 BC in the first invasion by Babylon, and he was taken with the captives. He was one of the young men who was put into leadership, probably made into a eunuch. His life would have been totally devastated as a young Jewish boy taken to Babylon. He was given a Babylonian name and given a Babylonian education. He had 3 years to figure that all out. And he ministered through the entire history of world dominance by Babylon and continued to minister after Cyrus received the kingdom. Cyrus destroyed Babylon, and it was a two-part kingdom, the Medes and the Persians. So you had Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian. But he continued on into after the fall of Babylon. That happened in 538, and in 536 BC, Cyrus returned the captives to Israel. Daniel did not return. We understand that he died around 536, but we really don't know. We just know that he was there when Babylon fell, and then he had his time in the lion's den. So the purpose of this book is to provide survival instructions for Jewish believers during the times of the Gentiles. The times of the Gentiles started when Babylon destroyed Judah in 586 BC. That's when the temple was destroyed, and God changed his way of working with the world. Instead of working through Israel and passing information to the Gentile nations through the nation of Israel. In 586 BC, Daniel was already in Babylon. God changed his way of working with the nations, and he put Israel, his people, under the domination of Gentiles, and it remained that way until in our own generation in 1948, when Israel became an independent state. However, today they are not similar doctrinally to what you would have had with believing Israel during the time of the Old Testament. Today it's a rabbi-directed culture, and if you want to find truth, it's difficult to do that in the current situation in Israel. And what God's doing is preparing Israel for their final discipline until they believe in the Messiah. But the survival instructions for Jewish believers during the times of the Gentiles. So the times of the Gentiles continue from 586 BC all the way through until the time that Messiah returns and Israel believes. So we are still in the times of the Gentiles, even though Israel is back in the land and to have governing authority. So that's the purpose of the book. How do you survive during this new administration? And the idea here for the readers would be that Jews should not abandon the Jewish distinctiveness, because after this easily recognizable, blasphemous global ruler is destroyed without human hands without human intervention, the Son of Man will receive an everlasting kingdom for himself and for his saints. So the everlasting kingdom will be brought to the saints by the Son of Man, and the Gentile nations will be destroyed. So that's the idea. How don't give up on your Jewishness just because you're now in the times of the Gentiles. And so you can see this going through. It also has a second track that runs through here where it's an evangelistic tract from human perspective, written in Aramaic. That's nice stories to tell that give an overview of what's going to happen in the world. God's already planned it. So let's look at Daniel. In chapter 1, you have Daniel's trip to Babylon and a determination by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to not defile themselves with the food that was prepared for them. Most likely the food here would have involved meat with the blood still in it. Nothing is actually said about what it was, but they determined they were better off to have vegetables and maintain their Jewish distinctives. So a 2-week test period was given, and they turned out better than the ones who were eating the food from the king. So everything worked out okay. So they reasoned, they requested, they appealed when they were oppressed by the Gentile ruling power. And the important part of chapter 1 is that when the king interviewed these 4 Jewish boys, the young men, they were better off. They had more wisdom than all of the other ones in Babylon. And although they were given Hebrew name or Gentile Babylonian names, in verse 19, it's interesting that when they were successful, Daniel records from the Jewish perspective. So chapter 1, maintain your Jewish distinctive during the times of the Gentiles. In chapters 2 through 7, this is the section that's written in Aramaic. Aramaic is similar in a lot of ways to Hebrew. In some ways, it's like the difference between being in the South or Canadian. I speak with a Canadian accent, and I'm not nearly as bad as some I know. But my wife is from the South. There's a significant difference. When I go visit North Carolina, I would have to take someone with me so they can interpret. They don't understand me. I don't understand them. But Aramaic and Hebrew are similar. You can take classes on Aramaic, but most Hebrew students don't, because all you need to do is pick up a grammar, and it'll give you everything you need for biblical Aramaic. There's not that much in Scripture that's written in Aramaic. Ezra has a passage, and some passages, and here we have it in Daniel as well. But from chapter 2, verse 4, all the way through the end of chapter 7, that's written in Aramaic, and that would be the common language that was spoken and written, so the language of commerce. So in chapters 2 through 7, what the Jewish captives and believing Jews during the times of the Gentiles should do is recognize the significance of God's plan for world empires that will rule over Israel. That's the focus. Which Gentile nations will rule over Israel? And in chapter 2, if you can picture a vegetable, a carrot with a 1 in it for chapter 1, that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is this very tall, skinny 2. That's Nebuchadnezzar's idol that he's going to build. He has this dream of this amazing idol. So in chapter 2, there are 4 sequential empires that conclude with 10 kings, and he starts with Babylon, the head of gold, and then Medium Persia, which is the silver, and then Greece, which is the bronze, and then the legs of iron, which is Rome, and the feet and toes would be the revived Roman Empire that has 10 kings, the 10 toes representing 10 kings. And then a stone cut out of a mountain without hands, it is, God does this, comes and hits the image at the feet and grinds it up and pulverizes it. All of the image collapse like you throw branches into a chipper shredder, and it eats it up and it becomes chaff and blows away, and the stone becomes a great mountain that fills the whole earth. Daniel becomes prominent in this because he's the only one who's able to tell the king, this is Nebuchadnezzar, only one who's able to tell him what he dreamed and what the dream meant. And so he's now becomes chief in charge of Babylon, and he gets his two buddies promoted along, or three buddies promoted along with him. And the interesting part here for us, which is still future, would be the feet. The Roman Empire divided into two parts, east and west. The legs separate from the rest of the image, and the toes and the feet were mixed, some with ceramic clay, some with iron. They didn't adhere. There's this final ruling kingdom, revived Roman Empire. It's a global empire. You can see that from the term that's used. The fourth kingdom this is chapter 2, verse 40. The fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, as inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters all things, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. And the toes of the kingdom are going to represent these kingdoms. And in the days of these kings, you see that in verse 44, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never end, and it will consume all these kingdoms, and it will stand forever. So chapter 2 is, from man's perspective, it's these glorious world kingdoms that go across during the times of the Gentiles. In chapter 3, and if you take and picture a 3, put it on its side like that, and there you have a 3 on its side with the smoke coming up. That's the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar decided everybody should worship and serve this wonderful, glorious image that he's built, and the 3 guys, they refused to do that. I don't know where Daniel is, but the point that is important here is that you don't submit to Gentile rules, even if it means that it's going to result in your death. So they're given the chance to change their minds. Chapter 3, 16, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But either way, we're not going to worship your stupid image. So he heats the thing 7 times hotter. Nebuchadnezzar was not known for restraints. And the result was the guys who cast him in there were burned, and the 3 that were cast in there were unharmed. And there's one that's along with them. I take it that's a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. And so Nebuchadnezzar makes a decree that if you speak against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, then you're going to be cut in pieces, and your house is going to be made into ash heap, because there's no other God who can do this. All right, so chapter 3, God's able to deliver from certain death. He can, but if not, then you die. But either way, you don't worship those Gentile idols. Don't submit to these rules that are placed upon you that are contrary to what we're supposed to do. Similar to Acts 4. Whether you do this or whether you do that, we're still going to speak in the name of Jesus. Chapter 4 is, if you can look here, I'll help you memorize that. You got to picture an Indian cow here, an Asian cow, a sad-looking cow, as you can imagine a 4 would be. It's reversed, I think, on the television, but that's life. Chapter 4 is Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. God is able to convert the most autocratic ruler because his kingdom rules over men's kingdoms. That's chapter 4. This is where he has another dream. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar actually tells what the dream is. Nobody can interpret it. Daniel comes and says, "Look, this is terrible news. Wish it was for somebody else, but you're going to become like an animal, and 7 years you'll wander around, and then the kingdom will return to you." And so, as you look at chapter 4, a couple of things. God gave to Nebuchadnezzar a global kingdom. You can see that in the interpretation, verse 20. All the earth, verse 22, the ends of the earth. Nebuchadnezzar, in his conclusion here, verse 17, God sets over these kingdoms of men, the lowest of men, true today of politics. And the point of chapter 4 is that Nebuchadnezzar became a believer. At the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, verse 34, lifted up my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me. That's his conversion. So in chapter 7, the lion who's given a heart of a man, Nebuchadnezzar became a good king after he became a believer, and his kingdom was returned to him. And the point of chapter 4 is that God rules over the affairs of men. There's this kingdom that God has that rules over all of the kingdoms of mankind. So his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" So chapter 4 is proof that God's able to convert the most autocratic ruler. When 1 Timothy, we're commanded to pray for the salvation of rulers, God's able to save even a fellow like Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 5 is you want to remember chapter 5, here's your 5, and there's your stylus with fingers on it. Chapter 5 is the writing on the wall. The Belshazzar, who was the final king of Babylon, we're not exactly certain of his relationship with Nebuchadnezzar, but he's certainly within memory. He should know better. But God is able, according to chapter 5, to remove foolish kings because his kingdom rules over men's kingdoms. So Belshazzar, with Persia knocking on the door of Babylon, he gets this great big feast, and handwriting appears with, it's actually not a hand, it's fingers holding a stylus, and it's writing where everyone can see it, and Belshazzar is terrified. And it says, "Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, you've been weighed twice, and your kingdom's taken away from you." And that night, according to verse 31, Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Darius the Mede is not the same as Cyrus the Persian. These are two different guys, so you have to keep that up. It's a dual king, the Medes and the Persians, and they work together well. The point of this chapter is that Belshazzar should have known better. His grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't know exactly if he's his grandfather, he had those 7 years until he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom and he appoints over it whomever he chooses, verse 21. So Daniel makes it through this. The only guy who died in the fall of Babylon was Belshazzar. He died that night. Now in chapter 6, you have to turn the 6 on its side. Okay, so there's your 6, and you can imagine that's a lion, the rump of a lion with the lion's tail. Now you know what's in chapter 6. Chapter 6 is going to be the lion's den. The point here is that God is able to protect his own people, even when they're governed by laws, rather than by a ruler. So far we've had Babylon, which the king's law, word was law. Perhaps that's why he was the king of the head of gold. So in terms of autocratic authority, no one compared to Nebuchadnezzar or the Babylonian way of administration. Whereas Medes and the Persians, they were governed by law. So in chapter 6, Darius appoints Daniel. He's being considered for placing him over all of the governors in the area of Darius's rule. But the ones who are there get the king, Darius, to sign a contract that for 30 days nobody can pray to anybody but him. And of course, the laws of the Medes and the Persians, they're not changeable. So, once he realized he'd been caught by his own arrogance, he had no option but to fulfill it and throw him into the lion's den. This lion's den would have had two entrances, one covering the hole, a rock covering their hole, which they threw him in. The other probably a gate down at the cave entrance where they managed to get these lions in there. But this was their method of execution, and they left these hungry lions in there. They didn't get fed unless if you had human beings to feed them. So Daniel's cast into the lion's den, and the king doesn't sleep that night and comes the next day, and Daniel says, "Look, I'm here, and I wasn't harmed because he believed in his God, and he was innocent." And so Darius wrote and established that Daniel's God is the God that everyone should fear, and that you can see that in chapter 6, verses 25 all the way through 27. Again, it's establishing that there is a God who rules over the kingdoms of men. So Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. You see chapter 7, verse 28. So there's lots of debate over these guys, but Scripture's, to me, very clear. One's Mede, one's Persian. They're related nations, but they're not the same. Different nationalities. Now in chapter 7, this plan of these nations going forward, from man's perspective, you look at chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. In chapter 7, you look at it from God's perspective, and he sees these nations coming one right after the other as if they are beasts. So this last one is the one that's most notable in Daniel, and this is a ferocious beast with teeth of iron, just a unbelievable nasty animal with feet that stomp everything to pieces. And we'll just take your 7 there and put that ridge on the back, and now you have chapter 7, which the main beast is this final one. In the time when you're looking at chapter 7, notice that these 10 kings, of these 10 horns. Oh, I forgot to draw 10 horns on my beast. There's one that comes up from the 10, and he conquers the 3 of them, and then the others give over power to him. You can see that in chapter 7, verse 24. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, this final kingdom, which I believe is a global kingdom. It's a revived Roman Empire, but it's not in the Roman Empire footprint. It's global. These kings arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones. He shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, and shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change the times and the laws. Instead of a 7-day week, we're going to have a 10-day week. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for times and half a time. Times in Aramaic. There's a dual in Aramaic and in Hebrew. So it's one time and then two times and a half a time. So 3.5 years. Times here is a year. And so this final world kingdom will be over the entire world. And before this little pompous, arrogant king comes, who's going to fight against the King of Kings, he rules over 10 regions. So it seems to me that before the Antichrist comes, perhaps in our own days, we're going to see increasing pandemics. We're going to see increasing terrifying things in heaven, in the stars, in the sky, plagues, earthquakes, and God is preparing the world to break into 10 regions. So if you take a Cadbury chocolate orange, I love those things, and you slam it down, it breaks along certain areas. That's the way the globe if you just take and look at regions, North America, South America, there's 10 easily identifiable regions. It's going to take that in order to manage the global problems. And so this structure is in place when the Antichrist comes up. So we might be alive when we see the rearranging of these 10 global nations, these 10 global regions that each have a king. And out of that comes Antichrist. And then there's one like the Son of Man. This is a favorite term that Christ liked to use for himself. One like the Son of Man comes, so that you can see that in verse 7:13. Behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. And his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So with chapter 8, anyway, he's done now with the Gentile communication. So the pictures, the visions, the beasts, the idols, that's done now. And we're going to return back to Hebrew with chapter 8 through 12. And these are not chronological. The date of the prophecies are given to us. Chapter 8 is 550 BC, and as I mentioned, the Hebrew begins back in chapter 8, verse 1. And the Jews are supposed to watch for a fierce, evil king who fights the Prince of Princes, but he's going to be destroyed without human help. And the important part here is that the Antichrist, who is this fierce, evil king, you can see that in verse 23 through 27, in the latter time of their kingdom, their kingdom refers to Media Persia and to Greece. In the latter time of those kingdoms, you're going to have an amazing guy. A king shall arise having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. As Christ is the seed of the woman, the Antichrist is the seed of the serpent. So he's in a league of his own for evil. He shall destroy fearfully and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper and destroy many, and he shall even rise against the Prince of Princes. I think that's Christ. But he shall be destroyed or broken without human hand. So in chapter 8, if you want to remember what's there, you have the 8 turn sideways. You have ram's horns. One comes up after the other. It's bigger. That's Media Persia. And then you have a goat with a single horn that's broken off, and it becomes 4 kingdoms. The Antichrist is going to be similar to Antiochus Epiphanes. So I think God gives illustrations in history of sinister rulers that in some ways have similarities to Antichrist. And Antiochus Epiphanes, who is in the subject of the latter part of the Grecian Empire, he is like that. In chapter 9, let's do our Budak here. So chapter 9, there's your 9, and you have to put it on its knees because Daniel is praying. And so this is Daniel's prayer, and his prayer is pretty simple. This is 538 BC. Babylon has fallen. His prayer is that God would start the counting of the 70 years from 605 when Daniel was taken captive. So, you know, when you look at these numbers, it's tough to figure it out from history. So my inclination is to go with Scripture. I understand that the decree that's referred to here is Cyrus's decree. 2 Chronicles 36, Ezra 1, Ezra 6, Ezra 7. These all refer to Cyrus's decree. And Cyrus decreed to rebuild both the temple and the city, both of them. Isaiah 44:28 and 45:12 both very clearly state that he was to rebuild the city as well. So rather than try to go to Artaxerxes and find some obscure passage, stick with Cyrus. That's the decree. And so the angel brings and gives the answer to Daniel's prayer, and he says there's 70 sets of 7. It's called weeks. That's because in Hebrew a week is called a 7. So there's 70 sets of 7s that are going to be given to Daniel's, answering Daniel's question about how long are the times of the Gentiles going to remain. So he breaks here in verse 25, he breaks it into 2 sections. The first 69 sets of 7, or 483 years, go from Cyrus when the decree is given until Messiah the Prince. So the Messiah the Prince, I take it that that's the triumphant entry of Christ into Jerusalem, where he's presented as the Messiah and the Prince. And that's exactly 483 years. Biblical years have 360 days. And I'm not going to try to fit that into our American calendar. We have a different way of doing things, and we know our calendar is wonky. So Christ was born 5 or 6 BC. How do you do that? But he breaks it into 2 parts, and there's 49 sets of 7, and then 434 sets of that makes the 483. There's one set of 7 left, and so we will talk about that, refer to that as Daniel's 70th set of 7, because 69 sets of 7 took us from Cyrus all the way to the triumphant entry. And if you look at verse 26, you can see that after the Messiah is cut off, the people of the prince who is to come, that's a reference to the Antichrist. The prince who is to come doesn't destroy the city, but the people do. That would be Rome. We know that Antichrist has a Roman mother, but the prince who is to come, and they destroy the city. That happened in 70 AD. And then we get into the 70th 7 in verse 27. Then he is this prince who is to come, makes a covenant for one set of 7. And in the middle of it, he breaks it. And this is in the middle of the tribulation. And he takes away the sacrifice. He sets up his abomination that works desolate, and so forth. So in chapter 9, the times of the Gentiles is limited to 490 years. That goes from Cyrus to Messiah, and then there's one more set of 7 that's still future. All right, so we'll do one last Budak to remember what's in here. So there's your 10 and your 11. 11's big here, and 12. This is your angel wars. So 10, 11, and 12 are the angel wars that gave rise to Peretti's books, probably, as you look at those, this present darkness and so forth. But chapters 11, 10, 11, and 12 are written to give a very detailed reconstruction a future construction of the history. So if you look at chapter 11, verse 1, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. This continuation from chapter 10, verse 1, in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, it goes through this section. But what I want you to pay attention to is that there's 5 Persian kings. In terms of the times of Gentiles, there will be 5, not 15 or 20 like we have in our history books, but there's 5 Persian kings who rule over Israel. So Babylon, it had Nebuchadnezzar. It ended with Belshazzar. There may have been one Nabonidus who was in there. I don't remember the name, but that's the footprint of Babylon. After Babylon, now you have 5, total of 5 Persian kings before Alexander the Great comes up in verse 4, and then his kingdom is there's lots of specificity here about his division of his kingdom. I've read that the priests went out and talked to Alexander the Great and showed him this passage, and he pretty much left the Jews alone. Now, when you get into this last section of verses 21 through 35, very specific details about this vile person. This is Antiochus Epiphanes, 175 to 164, and he tells about his history. And then in verse 36, the nuance changes. The Antiochus Epiphanes is put there to really talk to us about the Antichrist and that king. So you go from Antiochus Epiphanes in verses 21 through 35 to the Antichrist, who goes all the way through the rest of chapter 11. And so this vile Grecian ruler, the blasphemous king of the north who troubles Israel as ever before, that'll be the Antichrist. And then with chapter 12, you have the resurrection of the just. And then there's the conclusion of the human rule on earth. These numbers that are listed here take us into the celebration within the millennium. So this book is given to provide an overview of what's going to happen in terms of national, international world rulers. There just are not that many world rulers. Scripture names them all. All of them are past except for one, and that's still coming. The man of sin, the Antichrist, will be the final world ruler. And we'll see Revelation pick up this book of Daniel and put all of the details in chronological order. So that's a lot in 38 minutes. Sorry to go a little bit long. Lots more could be said, but this will get you on down the road on your own study. My love to you all. Bye-bye.